Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read Initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today I am very lucky to have Dr. Erin Schryer from the Maritimes join me to discuss her journey to the science of reading. Welcome, Dr. Schryer. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, Kathryn. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you here today.
Oh, my pleasure. Why don't you start out by telling our listeners who you are and what you do?
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Schryer, and I am, it's hard to define yourself that way, isn't it? So I own early learning and childcare centers in my community. So in Quispamsis, where I have lived all of my life, except for some years in Ontario and in Fredericton for school. And so those are licensed childcare centers, both in Quispamsis and St. John. I then also have a small elementary school, private elementary school, Origins Academy, in one of those centers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. I'm also a researcher, an advocate, currently heading up an association for early learning and childcare in New Brunswick. We don't currently have an association that represents our sector. So volunteer in that capacity, and all around just really passionate about structured literacy, the science of reading, and ensuring all of our children and our teachers receive the type of instruction that we know they need to thrive.
That's amazing and much needed everywhere. Thank you so much for joining me. So let's start back at the beginning. What made you want to be a teacher and an early childhood educator?
So interestingly, I don't have my Bachelor of Education. I think probably based on even my Facebook thread feed, a lot of my friends would think, or acquaintances would think, that I went for that B.Ed, but I didn't, because, and that was very purposeful, because I've always been really interested in our youngest learners. And in New Brunswick, and in fact, mostly throughout Canada, our youngest learners are not in our public education system. So I kind of went a little bit of a different route, did my undergrad in psychology, a master's in education, and then a Ph.D. in education, focused on how the brain learns to read. But if I back up, way back from there, my journey really begins with my brother, who struggled terribly in learning to read. And I've been thinking about this because as I've heard the stories that people have told with you, and I've heard on various podcasts that I listen to, all of us seem to have this, kind of personal piece to how we got here. And outside of just being educators, obviously that's a piece that's important to us as well. But it seems that most everyone has, an even further kind of personal stake in the game. And so for me, it is my brother that struggled terribly in learning to read, the experience being in a family that otherwise very fortunate. I will not, had a very fortunate upbringing here in New Brunswick. But that period when he was struggling, and I would say that probably lasted from kindergarten to grade 3 until he learned to read, was really quite traumatic for the family. And for me, it's one of those things that I want other families to avoid because of the kind of heartache and disruption it really brought to the family. So yeah, my brother was, in school with me, a couple years younger than myself. And of course, I was one of those children who seemed to kind of learn to read through osmosis. And we do know there's a small percentage of those, yet my brother was struggling. And so eventually he was pulled from the public system and put in a private school. And within about 6 months, he was reading. And how I wish I could go back in time and understand exactly what happened there and the mechanisms and the teaching approaches that allowed him to do that, because I'm certain that's a big piece of what happened there. But I don't know. So we have our speculation. But he learned to read. And so if I fast forward, I'm in university, Carleton University in my undergrad, and I'm in a class about neuroscience, about the brain. And the professor kind of just flippantly talks about dyslexia and about how, the brain can be wired differently and plasticity of the brain. And this is the first time ever hearing of any of this. And I immediately thought about my brother and reading and thought, there is another way. And he did learn to read. So he could learn to read. And just from then on became really obsessed about how we teach children to read, and that it appeared, as an outsider, very much an outsider at the time and young, it appeared that there were better ways that we could teach children to read, and that that we were somehow missing a big piece of the puzzle or the population too. And how could we avoid that? I mean, in New Brunswick, we have one of the lowest adult literacy rates in the country. And I always knew that because my parents, always wanted, for us to know about outside of our own home and what we did. And so I knew New Brunswick struggled with literacy rates, employment. Suffice to say, none of that has really gotten much better, unfortunately, over the years. But so I kind of continued along that road and wanted to do a master's, did my undergraduate in psychology, continued to learn about the brain, went on to a master's degree, and then a doctoral degree. One of the kind of seminal pieces I read in my master's was Louisa Moat's Teaching Reading is Rocket Science. So that would definitely be one we can link for people, and something anyone who kind of asks me about where to get started, it's read that. So that was something I read in my master's degree and kind of was sitting with me for a long time. And then, kind of worked on my doctorate, got that done. And then really, excuse me, the next turning point, Kathryn, was I had learned all of this stuff in school. Mm-hmm. And really self-taught for the most part. I mean, I did a dissertation in your doctorate. What's in your master's? Thesis. I did a thesis-based master's. So I was, doing research. So it really was leading it myself with, advisory team, but the content I was consuming myself. People have asked me, about science of reading based programs and such. And it's not that I really took that. If you go to the literature, that's what you consume, right? That's what you learn about. And so I came out of those programs with this knowledge, and then worked for a nonprofit supporting struggling readers. And the aim was to match community mentors and community tutors with these struggling grade 2. We had identified grade 2 as kind of that point where you want to get the intervention. And so spent 5 years there, very rewarding work. But what I really focused on was understanding what's happening in the schools. Again, how is there this disconnect between what very clearly the research shows how the brain learns to read, and what are the best teaching methods for supporting the majority of brains to learn to read, and the fact that, 50% of our adults don't read in New Brunswick, and they don't become that overnight. So we know it trickles up the school system. And so I spent those years just kind of really watching, establishing, relationships, offering my services around data-driven instruction and supporting teachers and schools that way. And really came to the conclusion that, there's instructional practices happening that don't work. And it was a real conundrum I was in, because I think for the first few years, I certainly doubted myself. I thought, I have missed something here. Like, why don't I know about leveled readers? Why don't I know? I remember a great, and she's an awesome educator, taking me for coffee to explain to me what a running record is and how to do a running record. And really me feeling like, how did I miss this? Why do I not know that this is important for teaching children to read? And come kind of full circle now to realize, those aren't methods that we want to be adopting. They don't necessarily provide us the information we need. And so then, really since then, I've been on this journey to bring structured literacy to families. I've done that through parent engagement sessions, through training with teachers, through, community engagements. And then most recently, I opened Origins Academy. And Origins Academy is a small little school that located in my hometown. So it's a great sense of pride to bring this to the community, but was really a response to the fact that, many children, we know from Nancy Young's Ladder of Reading, many children require structured literacy approach, and that it wasn't being offered necessarily. And so I was thinking about how I could do that. And then the big bad pandemic hit. and children were out of school and children weren't, necessarily doing much school at all. And because I'm in childcare, I then had all these school age children spending their full days with me. And it didn't take long. My team, we turned it around in 2 weeks. We said, those children need enrichment. They cannot receive nothing. And I do know this stuff. And so we created some really rock star enrichment programs to go from I think we closed in March. We were allowed to have children again sometime in May and took that right through until September. And then some children and families over the course of that time, we got talking and they didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay. And so again, with an awesome team that I had behind me, we said, well, let's do this. And including my own daughter for full transparency. And I think, again, when I think back to all these stories and how personal they are, and a lot of us are mothers, and I talk about you mama bear that. And my daughter, wasn't reading and wasn't doing well in that way in school. And despite everything I knew and was doing with her. And so, for her and for the 19 other students and families that wanted to come along with us, we started our inaugural year in 2020. We're in our second year now, and we've doubled our enrollment and doubled again for next year. And just really on a great journey with people who want to learn this, both inside the school, and I want to share this, Kathryn, for anyone who listens, and outside the school. I've had people say to me, oh, you went, to the private sector, and I just was too impatient to be in the public sector. And again, the mama bear part of me knew that the system couldn't change quick enough for my daughter. And even my son, who's starting kindergarten this fall, we're starting to see change, thankfully. But it's going to be slow, and it's going to take a lot of work and investment from a lot of people. And so, I will meet and talk to any teacher who wants to know what we're doing. The reason I share so much on all my childcare pages, on my school page, I maintain a professional page, Dr. Erin Schryer, where I talk about research-based methods for just supporting your children and helping them thrive. The reason I do all of that is to share, so that people, might pick something up, might ask a question or try something new. So it's a mouthful. That's my journey. Oh, I hope I didn't go on too long for you.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And the thing that I want to highlight, and I love that you're working with the age group that you're working with, is because there are the warning signs that we can detect at that age. I know in my own case, so I'm severely dyslexic, and my preschool teacher said something to my mother when I was 3 years old, saying, watch out, I think something is going to happen. And she forgot about it until I was diagnosed in grade 4 with dyslexia. And, over the years with the children that I've seen grown up, I've seen these red flags very, very early. And we now know that some of the best time to get the intervention is before reading instruction starts. I think a couple of weeks ago, I spoke with Nathaniel Hansford from Pedagogy Non Grata, and we were going through the meta-analyses on phonological awareness, interventions, and instruction. And the best time is in that pre-K year to get that intervention in. And so I think as a country, as a society, it's not just Canada that's dealing with these issues. We need to step up and realize there are things that we can do with our 3 and 4-year-olds that are going to make a world of difference for reading instruction. And I have 3 children. 2 of them have struggled with reading, and both of them, I saw those early warning signs when they were young. Now, I know not every parent has my background and level of expertise, but it's something that we can start teaching and training our preschool and early childhood educators with this knowledge and the ability to do these interventions and instructional programs, because they're not difficult.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that is, again, why that's how I landed. A lot of people, how did you land in that area of early learning and childcare? And it's, for me, it's the early learning. And you'll never hear me say daycare. You'll never even hear me say childcare on its own. It's a mouthful, but I've committed myself to early learning and childcare. Yes, care is a huge component of what we do, and in itself is very important. But the early learning piece, the capacity of these children to learn, the things they're learning despite us, and so what are those pieces? And that's the passion I bring around our preschool program. And so with, yes, the school, and that's at kindergarten, but it's working backwards. So then what does that mean in pre-kindergarten, in preschool? And I'm with you. I mean, we see things every day that we know are, perhaps a warning sign, or I'm noticing this. And I think in the early learning field, and I know we're going to speak about this more later this week and next week, but we're finding our path for what is our place to share this with parents. But I think no parent would say to you, oh, don't share that with me. I mean, certainly if you have professionals that are noticing things and knowing things, and to your point, yeah, a lot of this is really easy to implement, and children want to do it. My child walks around, he's 4, he's going to be 5 this month, blue, go. Like, we've done so much play with his language and sounds that it's just kind of a natural piece for him. And so we want to bring that to more children, to more families.
Yeah, well, and there's a couple other things that I'm thinking of, and one is the tragedy that we're losing those nursery rhymes and those fables that have this built in, implicit. So it's not intentional in the sense that we're saying, okay, well, this word rhymes with this word. It's just how the books are written, how their nursery rhymes are done, and it's showing that years before we had this research, even centuries, these are things that people knew were important for young children to help them with their language development.
Right.
And, you sing things like hickory dickory dock to some preschoolers, and they have no idea what you're talking about. But that was a staple. Right. The other thing I wanted to mention is the ability for these kids to just absorb new words.
Yes.
And we have to be intentional in that. And I think back to when my youngest was 3, we just moved to a new house, and there was a beautiful garden in the backyard. And, we would tell about the different flowers, and there was a hydrangea. And so I didn't call it a flower, I called it a hydrangea. And it was funny. So one day she took her grandfather out in the backyard, and he said, Granddad, this is my favorite flower. It's a hydrangea. And I never said, hey, this is a hydrangea. It's a type of flower. She just picked it up.
Right.
And if you have that exposure to the language, they just absorb it, because that's what their brain is designed to do in this period of life.
Right.
And there's so much that we can do to bring and build that background knowledge and that vocabulary for them. That's going to be such a huge predictor of success later on.
One of my favorite, it's a Facebook just picture that I share probably once a year. And it's essentially it's a picture of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And it's saying, if your child can say Tyrannosaurus Rex, they can say full sentences or big words, and, just kind of making that point of use those words with your children. And that's the language piece is so huge. And again, we'll talk about that more later this week, I know, but I mean, and that's the innate piece, right? Like, we know language is natural. So that is all children, right? That we start there. And I think that is part of the journey in ECE is then, but what is the next step? And for us, it is that literacy piece. And what does that look like? And we're seeing this even in kindergarten, right? What does literacy look like? What's the difference from language, and where do we start? And so that's the journey I've been on with my companies and my teams, having actually just a few weeks ago hosted a professional learning session to about 60 of my own educators. on, after language, what's next, and that there are those pieces, conversations around letter sounds, mark making, printing, things we're doing, but, with a lens for what does the research say, and where could maybe our practices change, or what things can we incorporate? So we had a really great discussion. I'm just kind of using some of the notes from that to inform our discussion later on Friday. I think we talk again. But yeah, and I think that for many in ECE would be that, that bridge from language. We've really known that language is natural. Language is, we immerse the children in rich language. But again, layering on literacy now, and what exactly does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Now, there are plenty of texts and resources for the science of reading or structured literacy once kids hit that formal schooling age. But do you know any great resources aside from your own for people to look at those preschool years?
Where'd you go? You can still see me? Okay. So there's one, and I actually just grabbed it. So I'll grab it right here. And this is taking me back to my master's and PhD. This was like a Bible for me. So this is Clinical Approaches to Emergent Literacy Intervention by Laura Justice. And Dr. Justice graciously sat on my advisory committee. She's at the Ohio State University now, speech language pathologist. So again, in my master's and doctorate, the journey there was linking a lot of the research I was reading was SLPs. And I remember thinking, I would have liked to be an SLP. Why didn't I know about that type of work? And I still feel that way some days. But that link between SLPs, ECE, kindergarten teachers, what we're doing, and now speak to a lot of SLPs and think about and talk about and strategize even around what their role can be. Certainly in New Brunswick, we don't have enough. I don't know if throughout Canada we do, working in our spaces. But this resource, around an emergent literacy, right? That was where I came from. That term was really popular in my master's and my PhD when I was talking about kind of children's emergent literacy. What are those, foundational literacy skills before our foundational literacy skills? So yeah, this is a great resource. It's been a while since I've really looked through it, but you can tell I have it all tabbed. And it was so I've grabbed that to take a look for Friday as well.
Wonderful. Well, one thing that you brought up is the importance of a speech and language pathologist, or an SLP. Can you give us a little bit of a more detail about what they can do in that ECE age range that can be really helpful?
Yeah, for us so far, it's been about ensuring educators understand the importance of language, how we can extend, very specifically, how we can extend children's language. One of the best things I've learned in the last couple of years is we had an SLP, and I'll invite them periodically to come in and just observe what we're doing, to provide us feedback. And so she did that. And something she noted was that as educators, we were asking our children a lot of questions. And she said, well, that's in a way great. The way to level that up is, these were, 18 to 24 month olds. So really asking them questions, they don't have the language to answer you necessarily, the expressive language, so that our time would be spent better narrating what's happening around us, naming things as you play, naming things, what you're doing. I'm going to put the cow in the barn. Oh, I'm going to open the door and really narrating what you're doing versus asking all these questions. One thing that is often found sometimes in childcare and in settings with groups of children is more directional language. I need you to sit here. I need you to not do that. I need you to move over here. And while she celebrated that, there wasn't much of that. It was the questions, and that really, there's limited value there. And so that, that was one of those things that just, I hadn't really thought of, and that she directed me to sometimes just listen to what the language is going on. There might be a lot, there might not be much, but it's not necessarily the quantity, but the quality of that language. And so, yeah, SLPs, we don't have enough, and, I would have them much more often. But, when we have had SLPs in, even understanding for all of my educators to understand all the different phases of language development that children go through, even, foundational, and for parents to understand this information, that children's receptive vocabulary typically outpaces their expressive. And that's why we know our children understand us. My own daughter, she came late to expressively talking, but, I could ask her at 2 years old to put the blue pair of socks in the second drawer, and she knew what I was talking about. So, there was no worry there in terms of her understanding and vocabulary, but the expressive came later. And so, SLPs have really been critical in teaching in ECE and educators, what those phases of language development are. And again, what I'm always really looking for and what I want to really give you Friday, so I'm going to prepare for that, is what exactly do we do though? What does that look like in practice?
And definitely, I'm really excited for that conversation. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is that SLP has so much knowledge about the phonological and the phonemic awareness, and we can identify issues at this young age for the kids that are struggling with their pronunciation of the words. And one of the important things to do in this age range is to, if they're struggling with how they're pronouncing words, is making sure that their hearing gets tested. And then if we know that their hearing is all right, we want to make sure that they develop the ability to discriminate, hear the difference between sounds, and know how to produce those sounds. In the early childhood years, there's so much experiments with sounds and how to use their mouth, but sometimes they need that just extra level of support to realize that some sounds may be different, even though they think they're hearing the same, and then just helping them understand how to produce that sound. This is very important for their ability to speak clearly, but later down the road, it helps them when it comes to reading and spelling. And it's one of those biggest predictors of future reading success in the 4 and 5-year-old age range.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it reminds me, that would be my most frequent referral, sorry, I was missing the word, is to SLP. We have a really successful program in my area called Talk With Me. Parents can refer, I can refer you, like their self-referral process, which is amazing. And those SLPs, that is their bread and butter, is this preschool age. And you're right, that really, if we kind of look at that as that's the very first building block. Like, I'd love to see a time when we could screen all of our children with SLP services to ensure there's not something, kind of more going on there, because it really is the foundation to that phonological and phonemic awareness eventually, right? That they can hear that and articulate those differences. So yeah, SLP referral would be the most frequent referral we do. And, to anyone listening, if you can get yourself in, even if you just have some questions, I did the process with my daughter, and even being in the field, those reminders of just again the narrating while she's playing, and that was kind of up until that vocabulary explosion piece. Haven't had the one-on-one kind of personal experience in terms of older children with the articulation and those pieces, but certainly have lots of students who do SLP therapy, and the impact on their reading, on their confidence, on their ability to keep up with structured literacy approaches is really marked.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know all 3 of my children received one-on-one SLP support because of their pronunciation issues.
Right.
And again, that being a predictor of future issues. But the thing to highlight here is if we catch it young and the children receive the appropriate intervention and support, they can have it so they aren't affected negatively later. Right. So they have caught up before they were even behind. And at this point, we're not giving them a diagnosis or anything. We're just noticing that this is a skill that they are weak in, and we want to get them up to where they should be so that they're ready to hit the ground running when they enter kindergarten.
Kindergarten. Exactly. That screening role, right? Like, and I know we're going to talk about that more, but what that screening role that we can play in early childhood education. I think it's a huge piece that we're missing in Canadian early childhood education, because you do have very experienced, educated people who are very well positioned to do this work. And just as you said, it's noticing, I'm noticing this, and it's working on those, and it's that early intervention piece without it, having to be a whole different, we have a process in New Brunswick called early intervention. So I'm talking about that kind of being more of the universal approach of early intervention. That's how I see the early years, really, is this universal approach, because they're in programming, they're with people who have those credentials and that experience, alongside really close relationships with parents, to ensure that children, as you said, and I always say, they can just get to kindergarten and fly with what's happening in their school.
And these interventions are most often language games.
Yeah.
Exactly. And kids really enjoy them. I mean, we do them for fun activities in the car. And, my eldest, who has more advanced phonological awareness skills, tries to teach the younger ones how to do them and how to manipulate them. And that's, not something that you need to become an expert at as a parent or an educator to an extent, but it's important to realize what the student or the individual needs at this point in their education. Now, the other role that I think is definitely underutilized, and part of that is because of availability, is the role of the occupational therapist. And, when children aren't in the early learning and childcare setting, they may not have the same exposure to those fine motor skill activities that are so crucial in those early years to develop the hand muscles.
Yes. And that would be, so we don't see a lot of occupational therapists. I learned more about occupational therapists probably in the last year than I ever knew, but more with the school, with the elementary school, as children were older. And I think you've hit it right on the head, Kathryn, because, and not, there's always, there's always other things happening, but most children in the childcare setting, they are experiencing those invitations, right? They are cutting, they're gluing, they're having sensory invitations all the time. And so at the very least, that kind of work is ongoing, and, it's a developmental process and strengthening those fingers and those hands. But certainly with the school, I had this shift of, oh, this child needs more of that. And certainly our approach is to provide it. But at a certain point, this, kind of the professional in that field is very warranted. So we do see occupational therapists, and I've learned a ton of things that we can do to adjust the environment, to strengthen different muscles and hand muscles for children to be able to achieve in those ways. But don't necessarily see it in our ECE as much, except in specialized kind of circumstances. But you're right, occupational therapy. I mean, all of these, and I think that if we go back to kind of that journey and that collaboration, it's all of us, right? It's not just the ECE, the teacher, the SLP. It's how can we all really work in collaboration together, and as I say, like swarm around these kiddos. And, certainly once children hit school, there's groups of them there, but there's groups of them in early learning and childcare centers all over our country as well.
Yeah. And so it's not just the fine motor skills that we want to develop in those early years. It's the gross motor skills and the coordination. And again, some of those activities you're talking about, like cutting and gluing and cross midline activities. So we're taking your right side of your body and moving it to your left side of the body, and vice versa. Those are so important. And doing those relay races and those fun games that you can do in the group setting of a early learning and daycare center.
I know.
And preschool environment, because you have those resources of several kids being there in a collaborative setting where they can have fun, enjoy the games, instead of just sitting on a couch slumped over a screen.
Mhm.
And yes, it's, one way to keep the child occupied, but it doesn't have that same development.
Right, right. And you're right. I mean, we talk a lot about, strength and balance and coordination from that perspective on the gross motor. I think a lot of times when people think gross motor, they do, even with young children. I have a lot of parents and educators equally who think sports. Well, what you mean, she has to play soccer or baseball? Or no, it is, running and jumping and climbing that tree. Thankfully we have trees all around us here in New Brunswick. One of our favorite things for the kiddos to do is climb those trees safely as they can. But all of that, coordination, strength, the balance that they are acquiring through that. I know I've read some really interesting research around the value of those pieces, like you're saying, for writing, for accessing both sides of the brain, and the wiring that needs to happen that way. So it's one of those things with the early childhood, again, is the opportunity really is it's the full picture, it's the full child. I think values wise, we've always in early childhood really looked at children as full people, and that they are not blank slates, and they come to us with all of these experiences and background knowledge and diverse backgrounds. But we also have the opportunity to really support their physical development. It's not just their academic, and it's not, just the negotiation of peer relationships, which is super important in early childhood. But it's kind of, we have these children, and for the most case, we have children for a long period of the day. Many of our children spend much more time with us than they do with mom and dad. It's just the culture we live in and the work culture that's required these days. So, I think that opportunity to wrap all of those pieces around children again in ECE is certainly there. And certainly I know the sector here in New Brunswick, again, throughout Canada, is really keen to elevate that piece of the education, of the early learning piece that we do.
Yeah. And talking about that, that environment of climbing trees, it's also important to go to the playground and run around on uneven surfaces. So you're not just doing it in the gym. Trying the the strider bikes and the different, the plasma cars and those different movements that you're not having just walking around on even level surfaces.
Right.
And, throwing the ball, hopping, learning hopscotch, skipping a rope. Those are all skills that unfortunately society has moved away from valuing. And again, these skills have been things that, some of them children have been doing for centuries, playing, jumping, skipping.
Right.
And when we're just inside our home, they're not getting the same exposure and the same variety of movement to build the skills and the ability to do these activities for them to succeed with the muscle development they need.
Yeah, you've probably, Nancy Young, again, who I know I referenced about her ladder of reading, but her entire, she has an entire it's a phonological, no, it's sounds, phonics. It's a phonics program.
Yes.
Correct?
Both.
And it's around movement, right? And how can you get children moving? So I think of her when you say that, but I also think I'm going to write this down for Friday because, I know last week I just saw the preschoolers doing a hopscotch in their classroom, but they were saying the letter sounds as they went. There was the actual grapheme was on the hopscotch, and they had to say the sound as they hopped. And so it was really neat to see them incorporating both of those things together. So I'll show you a couple of those examples on Friday. And, in our case, we get our children out all the time, majority of the day. That was a torrential downpour. But I thought, how quickly did that educator pivot? And we're not going to, be outside as long today. We certainly did still go out and get soaked and go in those puddles, but how could she then incorporate into her literacy piece some movement, knowing that, the children weren't getting what they were used to with us?
Yeah. That's amazing, because it's important to develop those skills and those resources that you can tap on in those moments where you're like, well, I had this activity planned, but I can't do it now because of the weather.
Right. Lightning is outside, so we're not going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, on your journey, you've mentioned Nancy Young's Ladder of Reading and Writing and her movement-based program. She has that available for both parents and educators. And these are great activities that allow it. And I find like her phonics program with the movement incorporated,
Mhm.
like a apple, I'm gonna pick an apple from a tree and eat it, right?
Right.
I remember doing those with my children when they were young, and my youngest wasn't even talking yet, but she was doing the actions and having so much fun. And then you can play Simon Says, or, what am I doing?
Right.
What sound am I being?
What sound am I making? Yeah.
Yeah. So those are all great, fun, engaging ways to get the kids involved, having fun, giggling,
Yes.
which is
Yes.
also a very important aspect in early childhood, in my personal opinion.
Absolutely. Well, and there's been some discussion of that too, online about, because I know in Ontario in particular, 4-year-olds do go to kindergarten. In my case, that's preschool. Like I have 3 and 4-year-olds in preschool, so I have them with me. But I've seen this kind of discussion emanating out of Ontario a bit about structured literacy, but about, showing people that it still is fun and it still is playful and it still, aligns with our values of well-being and silliness and dizzy play with children, that we really can incorporate all those pieces in. So I think that's a really important piece to make and note to make as well. And that we want to see people understand that are either in or touch on our sector, that this isn't, this isn't drill and kill. This is really fun language play. I think of, we have a really dear poet in our area, Sherry Fitch. And Sherry, I've spoke to her many times, but one time, she told, she plays with language and it's hilarious and kids love it. And if you ever get to see her live, it's just such a treat. But I mean, that's where I started with. It was just, and, because I a little obsessed with language, do love language and reading. But it's that playfulness with it. And again, back to even, as you said, like the fables and the fairy tales and the nursery rhymes. Happy to say, children at Origins in the Woods, they do know their nursery rhymes, because that is a really important part of our day. But again, that's because, we know that it's important. Does everyone know that that's important? And again, I think that's part of my journey now. The next piece in the ECE field is to share, I think importantly, you brought up how this also can be done really playfully, and that people recognize that, we're not talking about pushing curriculum down or asking 3 and 4-year-olds to read, but it's setting those foundational skills, priming children's brains to the sounds of language and the cadence of rhyme. Again, that can be done in really playful, fun ways that children ask for. Like if we don't do a nursery rhyme, we don't have a read aloud. It's, well, what's happening today? Like, where are the books? Why are we not laughing and having fun on the couch? So just, kind of becomes a really important piece of the day to the children as well.
Definitely. And there's so many great books out there. I mean, in our house, we love Julia Donaldson's books.
Oh, yes, me too.
And she has, the rhyming pattern built in.
Yes.
The book with no pictures. Kids love at that age because of the goofy sounds.
Yeah.
And, anytime that you can make a word game, or like Willoughby Wallaby Woo,
exactly.
Or if it's someone's birthday, instead of saying happy birthday, you do the first letter of their name. So if it's Bobby, Babby, birthday, ooh, Bobby. And those are things that, even though not all the kids will be ready for it, they'll start hearing it and understanding it.
Right.
And they'll be laughing along, especially if you're making mistakes, because like, you got it wrong.
Yeah.
And don't be silly.
Yeah.
There are great ways to engage children in these activities where we're not sitting with a drill deck in front of them, where they're sitting in rows and we're going through flashcards.
Right. Not at all.
And that's not what we're advocating for. You can have a structured literacy or a science of reading based program in a play-based system.
That's right.
The important difference in my opinion, now correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not as familiar with the early childhood research, but it's still important to make sure that it has that explicit component to it.
Absolutely.
So we're not doing the discovery based, and if you don't discover it, too bad.
That's right. Well, even, and that takes me back to this book. What this book was really important for me to learn, I remember, is, so I was studying read alouds, and, because we're all told read to your children, right? And so I was really interested in during my master's research on, well, what's the value of that? What really is the value? And what became very clear is it depends how it's done. And so interactive dialogic reading approaches much more impactful than even the really silly, rendering of the wonky donkey. Yes, it's fun. Yes, children laugh, and that there's a place for that. But we balance that also with these very interactive, what they call dialogic reading, where it's explicit. You bring children's attention. I'm looking around for a child's book. I don't seem to have any right here. But you bring their attention to the fact that I'm going to read you the title right now. The title of this book is The Wonky Donkey. Oh my goodness, there's 3 words in the word wonky, or in the title of The Wonky Donkey. Let's count them together. The Wonky Donkey. And so it's very much about it being explicit. So I love you saying that. You can see I'm getting all excited now because that's taking me back in there. And it is a Peace Friday. I'm going to talk about it, these read alouds, and how we can really up the ante on what we're doing. I think certainly in all of mine, and I just can't think of a friend or colleague that has a center in my area that they're not reading to children every day. It's a key piece of what we do. It's a key connection piece of what we do with children. But this piece, that there is a way to kind of level up what you're doing there and bringing children's attention right down to the letters. I mean, now they're looking for, oh, that's the C, that's in my name, clinical, call. Like my son will do those things. And so I think you're bang on there with that kind of explicit nature that we need, because otherwise we're just hoping, they get it. And over time, but time is precious, majority will, but what about those ones that won't, right? And a real philosophy I hang on to is that we try our very best. We are not perfect and we're learning, and it's a journey. But we adopt those approaches that are beneficial to all, but essential to some. And that for me is that explicit nature most of the time. Some children that is going to be absolutely essential, that it is made very explicit what you were teaching, how you were teaching, what you wanted them to know.
Yeah. And I think it'd be done in a very playful manner, especially when we're teaching concepts about print. So, hold a book upside down, start from the last page and go
exactly.
To the next page. Yeah.
What? I can't read it. What's happening here? And they're, oh, turn it over, do this, do that, And so, yeah, absolutely.
And then through that dialogue while you're doing, oh, I see, I had the book the wrong way around.
Right.
Oh, I started at the back instead of the front. Read the last word first and read it backwards.
Right.
And I'm like, wait, stop. Oh, that's not how you do it.
Right.
But that's a very playful, fun activity. You're not sitting there, this is a book, and we open it like this.
Right.
Like, yeah, you may have a little bit of that, but it's not something that you're doing on a daily basis.
Right. Well, and that's where, and I hate to even use the word balance because I think we're all so traumatized by balance literacy. But it is that balance, of time, because I'll have kiddos every once in a while that they will say to me, they'll say, Miss Erin, can you just read the book like it's written? Because, I might be being funny and trying to engage them in that piece, but, sometimes they just want that really expressive reading as well. So I think that, for us is really the key piece in having that play and playfulness piece to what we do with young children. And it's key for engaging them. But you're right. Like it's like they don't even know they're learning as they're going through it.
Yeah. It's that implicit nature of things that you're actually doing explicitly, but they don't realize it.
Right.
And when you spoke of that, can you just read it normally? I think of a quote, and I don't know the exact words, but it was about Robin Williams, who was reading storybooks to I think it was his daughter. She said, Daddy, can you just do it without the voices? Yeah. And imagine telling Robin Williams don't do voices.
Yeah.
Of all the people in the world, but of course his child like that, you do them all the time, get it, like,
Right.
you're only so funny. So I think that's important. And we do have a lot of people on the call, so I do want to give them the option to put a question in the chat if there's anything specific they want to know before we go. We have about 10 minutes left, but I definitely have more things to talk about, but I don't want to be the one always asking all the questions if there's other interests. Now, when you do the preschool stuff, and I guess we're talking more about your journey, what do you think those biggest steps are from where you first started to what you're doing today?
I think having that full understanding of the continuum of what, the most basic to the most complex skill within each of the 5 areas. I certainly was building that through I remember in my master's being in a kindergarten classroom. I had a lovely teacher who let me observe her for a whole year and document the literacy instruction that was happening. And I interestingly just looked at that data about a year ago, because I was just starting my journey and, kind of learning from her and reconciling that with the literature. But I think it's that just really having that really good grasp of what the most basic to complex skill is within those, those 5 big ideas, and being able to understand where children are at and where they need to go next. For me, that's, such a big piece of it, is that we really understand what children know, where are they going next. If they're not moving on to the next piece, what we need to change as educators in our instruction, or what practice needs to happen, what that link between home and school needs to be to support a child with, the practice they may need for that. But I think that's the biggest piece, and having a plan, like really knowing what the plan should be versus, I think early on, thankfully, again, I didn't know about leveled books and predictable patterned readers. And so I've never done those things. But I certainly, didn't necessarily always understand kind of where to start and how to get children there. And also, I think the value of coming back, I would get this question a lot that, well, a child, she's in grade 3 and she's not reading, so where do I start? And I would be a little, well, I'm not. And now it's like, you start at the beginning. I mean, you have to start at the very beginning and screen for those, those letter sounds. What is the blending ability? What is the word reading ability? And you have to start. I always talk about it as like the foundation of a house. And if there's cracks in it, eventually things will get difficult. And that's why I see so many children at grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, so that we just have to go back to the very beginning. So I think that's probably the biggest kind of piece in my journey, and why I feel better today than I might have felt 5 years ago. But again, I love the word journey, Kathryn, because it's still a journey, and I learn things every single day. And what I do today looks different from what I do, tomorrow.
Of course. Now, you mentioned those big 5, and I just want to explicitly speak to them. So phonological awareness and phonemic awareness is definitely something that's an important element of any preschool. Phonics is something that you can introduce, but don't be too, depending on where your students are at. Yes, they can learn phonics at this young age, some of them, but we're going to have definitely students that don't have the knowledge. Vocabulary is essential to work on. And it's more that implicit learning, working on building their expressive vocabulary, which is the words that they can use, and the receptive vocabulary, which is the words that they can understand. Fluency. Now, we're not looking at reading fluency in this phase, but we want to have that letter naming fluency built up as much as we can, so that they can see the letter A and recognize that it's the letter A. Yes, this is stuff that they will be doing once they go to kindergarten, but it's, again, one of those key predictors of future reading success in kindergarten is the ability to name letters of the alphabet. Yeah. So working on that is a great asset to your program. The final one is comprehension. Now, in the preschool years, we're not going to be working on reading comprehension where our students are reading the text themselves, but listening comprehension is a key element of reading comprehension. So we can be using those skills and teaching them those strategies during our reader alouds and asking them and guiding them through the questions that they're asking. I wonder why they thought that. Do you think they really mean that? Those are things that we can do to actively engage our students in the story while teaching them and modeling how to really understand what's happening in the book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And those are the key pieces. And when you say listening comprehension, that's one that this year has come up. There was some concern around that, it was the child just really that comprehension was not there. And it's the family and we've had consultations and now, they've been seeking both some SLP support and through their doctor. And, there's something there around procedural for that child that is very difficult. And so they're working with some professionals on supports for that. But again, I think back to knowing what those 5 big things are, and thank you for explicitly saying them for our listeners, and then arming ourselves with then what does each of those look like typically, and then what can we be noticing around those. So again, it's always about for the best interest of the child, and if we're noticing these things, what things can we either change or do or communicate with the family that are important for him or her.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Erin. I can't wait to our next conversation on June 24th, where we're talking about what's happening inside your schools and inside your classrooms and your early learning centers.
Yes.
It's going to be very exciting.
Yes, looking forward to it. Thank you so much for your time today and for listening to me drone on about the journey that continues, and I'll see you Friday.